marvelous long reads.
We have been diving into the world of Crossed once again, and this time we bring you the saga of two brothers. One who has failed at every step of his life, and another who has seemingly made a successful psychologist out of himself. But things are never as they seem, and when the C virus breakout causes these brothers to reunite, what kind of secrets will they uncover? How will they deal with the massacres around them? Will the psychologist shed any light on the Crossed through his training? Or will he succumb to the virus just like the others? Find out this and more in this video. Crossed, Shrink, Issue 1, Feelings. The world of Crossed will break you no matter who you are. We've seen this time and again with all the stories we've covered. Whether you're a hardened criminal, a highly trained soldier, a psychopath, or just another guy on the street, the world will end up breaking you before the Crossed gets you. And sometimes the world doesn't need to do much. Sometimes the cracks that have already been inflicted upon you simply end up widening as the C virus spreads across the world. This is the story of Jack, and we start our tale in Jack's childhood, a brooding boy who hid his true feelings behind his polite and calm words. Jack tells us that if one wants to understand the concept of yin and yang, then all they have to do is to take a look at him and his brother. He feels that God, fate, destiny, whatever you might call it, was already compensating for his existence when his brother was born when he was 3 years old. With a lifeless expression on his face, Jack eats the casserole his mom made while she tries to spark a conversation by saying how she had expected herself to fail while making it. Jack, however, is too lost in his thoughts to answer her. He tells us that there's a reason why he is always painfully polite to everyone, and that's because the idea of someone disliking him or being offended by him literally frightens him. This is when his mother gets up to grab some more of the casserole, and true to his nature, Jack politely asks for seconds as well. He knew he was doing what was expected of him down to the last letter. After all, he was the oldest child of a single mother. He was desperate to supply his mother with the love she'd been denied by his dad. His mannerisms, his speech were smooth and calm, never too harsh, never out of turn. But Jack's entire being was a direct contrast to his brother, Clancy. This is when we're introduced to him. Clancy has red hair, golden eyes, and a certain, shall we say, talent for obscenities from a young age. While their mother is gone, Clancy makes an obscene gesture to Jack and then mocks him for always sucking up to their mother. And this talent, the ability to turn a phrase into something horrific and obscene, aged like fine wine. Clancy was a potty mouth, but he was also quite driven by lust from a young age. It started with complaints from his teachers and principals, for Clancy would make unwanted advances on the girls in his school. This soon turned into juvenile arrests as he grew older. While Jack was busy being a model student who held an impressive 4.0 average throughout middle school, Clancy had collected 3 arrests, 2 for vandalism and 1 for public lewdness. Their mother putting Clancy on house arrest had no real effect on his attitude. If he couldn't go out to see the women he was dating, they would end up in his bedroom at home. Multiple times, Jack walked in to see them doing the deed, and every time Clancy refused to put a sock on the door. When he turned 18, Clancy left their home. His mother wept and pleaded, but Clancy didn't stop. She didn't even get a goodbye, simply a phrase that cemented how much Clancy hated her. Jack went on to study in a prestigious university, and by the time he was done, he'd earned a degree in psychology, and it had been 6 years since he had last heard from Clancy. But that all changed around roughly 2 weeks ago when he got a new friend request on Facebook. It was from Clancy, and upon accepting the request, Jack learned that Clancy was going to be in town in a few weeks, and if Jack wanted, the two of them could catch up. Clancy got that message the same day the news stations around the world began to frantically report on the C virus breakout, an outbreak that turned people into hedonistic zombies. And so we catch up with Jack 2 weeks later in the suburbs of a very remote town at his home. A girl named Tiffany is staying with him, and Jack took her in while she was on the run from the Crossed. Jack has been hoarding coffee like a madman for the past 2 weeks, and he hands Tiffany a mug while telling her that it might not taste good, but it'll help them get their caffeine fix. Tiffany jokes that when you're on the run from the Crossed, you tend to forget about your caffeine addiction, and then goes to thank Jack for taking her in. When Tiffany stumbled into this town and encountered Jack, she was surprised to learn that the town had been relatively unscathed. None of the residents was infected, and none of the Crossed had made their way here up until now. Jack goes on to remark that though he hated such a remote and isolated place, this town of Woodhill has indeed saved his life in the aftermath of the outbreak. This is when Jack and Tiffany lock eyes, and after a brief moment of tension, each of them looks in different directions. They then head outside and continue the conversation, and we see Jack wave to his neighbors. The conversation soon turns towards the topic of families, and this is when we learn that Tiffany had to be the sole witness of her family's massacre. As for Jack, he hasn't heard from his mother after she moved up to Boise with her husband a couple years ago. He tried contacting them after the outbreak but got no response. Tiffany comforts him, and this is when Jack reveals that he has a brother too. A brother with enough tenacity to survive what's going on in the world. 4 days later, we catch up with Jack again. He's lying in bed, and clearly the temptation of having a woman like Tiffany in his house is getting to him. He tells us that he has stopped walking past the guest room at night, lest the sight of a bare Tiffany tempt him into doing the unthinkable. Even in this world of the crossed, Jack feels the need to be gentlemanly because of his crippling fear of someone fighting him untowardly. Jack finally decides to take care of his needs and starts removing his underwear when suddenly the screeching of tires outside his house distracts him. A speeding car makes an erratic left turn and then crashes into his house's garage door. Jack quickly sprints outside, fearing the worst. As he jumps down the stairs, Tiffany catches up with him, and he quickly tells her to hide in her room until he comes back to get her. She does as she's told, and when Jack peers into the crashed car, his worst fears come true. It's none other than Clancy in the driver's seat, and beside him is the dead body of a crossed woman. Jack begins to ask Clancy all the questions that hound his mind, but Clancy simply pulls out a hunting knife and says, "I'll explain everything in a bit, but for now, you're gonna do what I tell you to do, or else I'm going to stab you in your goddamn face." Jack was never a fighter to begin with, so he complies with Clancy's demands, who forces him to retrieve a bunch of padlocks and steel chains from the trunk of his car. Clancy then forced Jack to clear out his old room of all his relics, and then, once that was done, Clancy jerry-rigged the door to his room with the chains and padlocks that he brought in. Then, as he half-heartedly smokes a cigarette, Clancy gives Jack the much-needed explanation that he's been so desperately craving. Clancy tells Jack that most of what he assumed would have become of him holds true. Since leaving at the age of 18, Clancy has spent his life drinking, injecting nastiness into his body, and getting on the wrong side of the law. Clancy had known that this was going to be his future long before the crossed. He always knew how his life would end. He knew there was no hope for a bastard like him. But Jack was different, and Clancy knew that too well. Jack had always been the one with potential, and when Clancy found out that he'd become a fancy head shrink when the outbreak began, he came up with an idea on how to make something of himself. He looks Jack straight in the eyes and says, "So Jack, I'm going to give you one last chance to overthink your way out of a miserable reality. I want to be your chance at redemption, and you're going to be my way out of this long, fucked up life. My only request is that you chain me up in this room and treat me just like I know you've always wanted to. I'm going to be your first real patient, and you're going to figure out what goes on in the brain of a crossed. And if you can do that, maybe you'll have a chance of surviving." Jack had thought he'd heard everything from Clancy. The most heinous of insults, the most deplorable of obscenities. Jack lulled himself into a false reality where he'd begun to assume that no matter what Clancy said now, it wasn't going to catch him off guard. But this is pure lunacy. Maybe Clancy has finally gone crazy. Maybe he simply lost it. Jack screams at Clancy and reminds him that he isn't even infected. And this is when Clancy pulls out a piece of cloth from his pocket. Turns out the cross woman in his car used to be his girlfriend. When she got infected, Clancy shot her in the head and brought her here. He then sliced off her ear carefully so that he didn't get infected. And that ear is the thing currently wrapped in the piece of cloth in his hand. Jack tries to stop his brother from doing the unthinkable, but Clancy simply smiles, brandishes his knife, and says, "You know, I kind of missed you, Jack, but it's time to get that door secured." And with that, Clancy bites into his girlfriend's ear and infects himself. Jack looks away. The sight is too gruesome and everything is moving too fast. Clancy warns him to bar and lock the door over and over again, but Jack simply fails to do so. He panics first and then goes into denial the very next second. But when Clancy's voice begins to change, Jack finally finds his strength and manages to close the door. Jack then gathers himself, puts on a brave face, and explains all this happened to Tiffany. To his surprise, she's quite understanding. But then again, if you manage to survive in the world of the crossed for 2 weeks on your own, all the craziness becomes normal. Over the past few hours, Jack's fortified the door to Clancy's room, locked it at every corner, and cross-checked the chains for any weak links. But the fact that Clancy hasn't uttered a single word since he turned is getting to him. Why won't Clancy speak? The crossed are vicious when it comes to obscenities, yet Clancy's remained completely silent all this time. Jack tries to call out Clancy, tries to coax him into a conversation, but it doesn't work. Unable to come up with what to do next, Jack and Tiffany decide to leave Clancy alone for now. Jack and Tiffany spend the evening walking around town while talking to each other. Jack learns about her past, her family, and through it all, he can't help but wonder how strong she is. She fascinates him. Tiffany watched her entire family get slaughtered, yet here she is, laughing with him, consoling him selflessly. When they get home, Jack forces Tiffany to go to sleep while he tries to talk to his brother again. She offers her help in case anything goes wrong, and Jack reassures her that he won't do anything stupid. That night, Tiffany kisses him on the cheek for being so sweet, and with an elated heart, Jack slowly heads downstairs, trying to etch the feeling of Tiffany's lips into his memory. Jack brings food for Clancy and tries to get him to talk under the pretext of sustenance, but when Clancy refuses to answer, Jack loses it and bangs on the door. He screams loudly, and then he finally gets a response. Jack begins to laugh quietly on the other side of the door, and this is when Jack assumes that maybe Clancy wanted to talk to him privately. However, Jack steers the conversation, and quickly he begins talking about his lustful tendencies, how he would love the touch of a woman right now. This catches Jack off guard. He's flustered, and this is when Clancy begins to graphically describe his desires. But then something changes. For some reason, Clancy changes his mind. He doesn't want a woman. No, he wants Jack. And he describes very graphically all the horrid and inhumane things he would like to do to Jack. Jack, meanwhile, seems confused and a little aroused, to be honest, and this is exactly the kind of response Clancy was hoping for. He begins to tempt Jack, begins to describe in vivid details all the things he would like to do, and Jack simply holds his head between his hands, unable to come up with a proper response for his brother's advances. Clancy then smashes his head against the door and tells Jack that he desperately wants to kill him, and this is when something clicks for Jack. He adjusts his specs, brings a chair into the basement, and then takes a seat. If he's going to do this, he's going to do it right. Jack will respect his brother's last wish. He will psychoanalyze him, and so with his notebook and pen in hand, Jack calls out to Clancy again and says, "Tell me, Clancy, how long have you felt this way?" Crossed Shrink, issue number 2. Under the surface. We now look into Clancy's past. A week ago from today, when he was at a bar avoiding the outbreak and drinking his worries away. Beside him is the owner of the bar who's doing the same. Clancy vomits his guts out and the owner simply cheers him on because now Clancy can start all over again. The owner then confesses that he's too drunk to remember what they were talking about, and Clancy simply scoffs and tells them that his life isn't interesting enough to keep them entertained while the world around them crumbles. The owner smirks because that's exactly why he built this bar in the middle of nowhere, as his retirement retreat. He loves hearing stories from people who end up here. And so, reluctantly, Clancy continues and tells the owner about his brother Jack, who according to Clancy is one of the worst humans on the planet. This is when we switch back to the present. Jack is sitting outside Clancy's barricaded room with a notebook in hand. He tells us that he's decided to focus on how Clancy is dealing with the change emotionally before bringing up his little brother's past. He starts by asking Clancy how he feels right now, and Clancy graphically tells him that he has a raging erection that won't go away. Jack concludes that this means that being confined and deprived of human contact arouses Clancy. He then decides to ask Clancy what he would do if he had total freedom right now, and Clancy tells him that he would turn Jack's insides into a cake and then serve it to his college friends. Jack in turn interprets this as Clancy finding his higher education threatening, to which Clancy responds by farting at the door. This goes on for another half an hour until Jack decides to take a different approach. He now decides to question Clancy about the specifics of the crossed infection and its psychological effects on him. He asks Clancy if he feels nauseous, and his little brother responds by telling Jack that he wants to puke in his mouth, and then when that's done, they can take turns violating each other. Jack ignores the comment and instead implores Clancy to realize that no matter what he does, it won't diffuse his aggression or unbearable sexual cravings. Clancy responds with an expletive, and Jack implores Clancy to stay on track. He then asks Clancy if he feels any physical pain, and this is when Clancy reveals that he has been furiously self-stimulating for the past hour, which has caused his rod to chafe and bleed. Clancy likes the pain of it. Jack comments that the entire ordeal must be hard for him, and this is when Clancy makes the obvious joke and then relieves himself on the floor. After some time has passed, Jack takes a break and goes to the washroom to wash his face. As he does so, he can't help but feel this entire exercise is futile. His initial assessment tells him that Clancy is incapable of communicating properly. Despite that, he seems to pick up on emotions and energies. Few random words here and there seem to trigger an emotional response. The good part about this is that there is something inherently Freudian about their dynamic. Jack can use Clancy's visceral reactions to map out what emotional memory he seems to have retained after being infected. But when he goes back into the basement, he finds Tiffany standing outside Clancy's room. Jack quickly apologizes for anything untoward that his brother might have said to her. However, this is when Tiffany reveals that Clancy hasn't said anything since she's been standing there. This completely puzzles Jack. How could an infected Clancy find the resolve to stay silent in the presence of a woman? Moments Moments ago, he was busy describing all the horrific things he would do to Jack and Tiffany, so why is he silent now all of a sudden? He tries to coax Clancy into talking, tries to rile him up. And though this is working on his little brother, Clancy seems to have his own ulterior motives. To keep himself from talking, Clancy shoves his thumb into his left eye until it pops and begins to bleed. Clancy then begins to consume the mixture of blood and vitreous humor. Jack is completely baffled, and this is when Tiffany suggests that maybe the therapy is working on Clancy. Maybe this is the reason why he hasn't said anything in her presence. Jack tells her about all the horrific things Clancy was saying about them during the session, but this doesn't seem to deter Tiffany at all. In fact, she seems to be getting emotionally invested in Clancy's recovery with each passing second. She tells Jack that she saw her family get murdered by the Crossed. It took a lot out of her, to the extent that she even thought about taking her own life. But then she latched onto hope in order to survive. Hope that this was just a natural phenomenon, a natural course in the path of human evolution. Maybe there's hope for the Crossed too. Maybe they can evolve just like the humans. Maybe that's what's happening to Clancy. After all, humans themselves were once primitive half monkeys, flipping crap at each other, killing each other over bison meat and berry pickings. Tiffany places her hand on Jack's shoulder, hoping he would understand how she feels. But Jack coldly removes her hand and tells her that there is no hope. All the world has now is the Crossed. Then he points to Clancy's barricaded door. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of Woodhill, the menace that has gripped the world seems to be lurking, slowly and approaching with each passing second. A naked Crossed biker is making his way through the woods while furiously self-harming his privates. The Crossed man seems to be determined. He seems to have a mission, and when we are shown his eyes, it's clear that he won't stop no matter what happens. The next morning, Jack is outside sipping on some coffee while memories of his brothers from the past flood his mind. Jack remarks how this tends to happen when someone you had cut out of your life suddenly comes back. We are then shown the memory currently troubling Jack. It was one of those rare times in his life when he had managed to find himself alone with a girl in his car. It was his friend Emily, and Jack tried to break the ice by complimenting her that she looked awesome that night. Emily awkwardly thanked him, and Jack then brought up the dance. He awkwardly talked about it until he finally found the courage to ask Emily out, but she quickly shut him down because she had told him numerous times that she doesn't feel that way about him. Jack quickly apologized, and silence soon took over their conversation once again. By the time Jack found the courage to implore Emily to give him a chance, knocking on the driver's side window interrupted their conversation. It was his brother Clancy, and he was licking the window to embarrass his brother. Jack tells Clancy to beat it, and Clancy retorts by telling Jack that he was simply there to check if his big brother had gotten his feelings hurt once again. Jack then tells Clancy to piss off once again, but his little brother simply ignores him and addresses Emily. He then reveals that he's heard Emily letting Hart Mackins pleasure her orally a few times a week, and this makes Emily blush. He then begins to embarrass Jack by telling Emily about how little endowed his big brother is, and that she really made a better choice by choosing Hart instead. Jack doesn't confront his brother, nor does he scream at him. He simply goes and complains to their mother, who in turn reprimands Clancy. Clancy, in return, calls his brother a wimpy child for being a tattletale, and this is when his mother gets livid. She, in turn, berates Clancy and tells him that Jack is the only man in this house. He's the only one who cares for others' feelings. He's the only one who hasn't been arrested multiple times, and he's the only one thinking about his future. This infuriates Clancy, and he storms off upstairs while his mother in the background screams that he'll be grounded for a week if he doesn't get back here. Many such incidents are the reason why Jack has been unable to look Clancy directly in the eye. He knows that their dynamic and his choices are what cemented Clancy's life as a failure. Jack was the big brother after all. It was his job to help Clancy. It was his job to save him. Jack still believes what he told Tiffany. He still believes there's no hope for a Crossed Clancy, but he knows that it's about time that he spoke to Crossed Clancy about their relationship as brothers. He starts the conversation by telling Clancy that he better eat the raw meat that Jack is getting him, because he's pretty sure that the stores will run out soon. He then asks Clancy if he feels that Jack was a fair brother to him when they were kids, and this is when Clancy begins to laugh like a maniac. Jack probes further, and this is when Clancy coyly implies that he's been indulging in self-mutilation. Jack panics and reminds Clancy that they need to work together in order to see this through. If he continues to harm himself, then their little experiment will fail. But Clancy seems obsessed with his fingers. He calls them digits, and when he tells Jack to guess what he's going to do with his digits, Jack already knows he's going to shove them up his butt. Clancy does the deed and begins to laugh loudly, and this is when Tiffany enters the basement. She sees Jack giving up on Clancy, and Tiffany decides to step in instead. She begins to engage Clancy despite Jack's multiple attempts to stop her. Tiffany introduces herself, tells Clancy that she's Jack's friend, and when Clancy doesn't respond to her, she says, "It's okay, Clancy. I know you're suffering, but we're not going anywhere." And this is when Jack violently grabs her and shouts, "Tiffany, stop! He isn't healing. He isn't getting any better." Jack goes on to tell Tiffany how Clancy was self-mutilating and violating himself minutes ago, thinking that she would change his mind. But to his surprise, Tiffany stands up for herself. She pulls her hand away and warns Jack never to do that again. She then tells him that he just likes being a cynic. It would be easier for him if Clancy never got better. After all, before controlling her or touching her, he should remember the horrid relationship he has with his brother. She then storms off, and Jack is left alone to simmer in his own anger and shame. That night, Jack pleases himself while thinking of Tiffany once again. Once he's done, he realizes that he's stuck in the house with the two worst kinds of people. One who wants to kill him and is apparently manipulating the other into disliking him. Though at first he may have thought the Crossed aren't smart, it now, however, seems that their innate talent for sadism may be more developed than any human on the planet. Clancy hasn't spoken in front of Tiffany because he knows this would gain her sympathy, and more importantly, it would make her see Jack's flaws. The rosy future that Jack was hoping to have with Tiffany in the wake of the apocalypse is now actively being destroyed by Clancy. As Jack stares out the window that night, he wonders what other horrors the Crossed might have in store for them. And on the next page, we're shown the Crossed biker running through the woods while harming himself. He then suddenly stops and begins to laugh loudly, because in the valley below is the quaint, isolated, and unaffected town of Woodhill. Crossed, Shrink, Issue number 3, Revulsion. We start this issue with a peculiar sight. It's Tiffany, and she's sitting on the floor in front of Clancy's room. We learn that she's been talking to Clancy for quite some time now, and as expected, Clancy hasn't spoken a word in her presence. Tiffany tells Clancy how she used to see stereotypical femininity as a weakness when the world hadn't been infected by the Crossed. She started off policing her own sensitivity to fight the system. Tiffany used feminism as an excuse instead of truly understanding what that idea stood for. But when the outbreak began, Tiffany quickly learned that under the right circumstances, a person's pretenses can be quickly ripped off like an aging scab on your skin. She continues to tell Clancy how she feels, how when she watched her own parents murder her brother, she soon realized that the only thing that separates humans from the Crossed is empathy. However, Tiffany is quite careful. She doesn't use the word crossed. She instead calls them something else, probably because she thinks that word might offend him. She then starts talking about the day that her family was murdered. She watched them get surrounded by the Crossed, and she knows that in that moment, a big part of her wanted to join her family in their deaths. But she was dazed and overwhelmed by the mere stench of the Crossed, that horrid smell of death. Her mind wasn't ready to accept reality. It wanted to deny what was happening right in front of her eyes, but her nose couldn't lie that well. Her nose could smell the Crossed, and that's how she knew that all of this was real. Tiffany still remembers that smell vividly. It was what she registered as the Crossed began to devour her father while he was still alive. That nasty perfume of blood, shit, cum, and decay. Nothing had ever smelled like that in the history of this planet. That smell was more than enough to let Tiffany know that this was no nightmare. This was reality. And so when her little brother begged her to run while he was being dragged away by the Crossed, Tiffany complied. In that moment, the walls that Tiffany had built around her crumbled to dust. She realized that this new world didn't allow her the comfort blanket of her false self. Tiffany took off running, crying and weeping all the while, wishing that someone would hold her and comfort her, wishing desperately that someone knew her truly before she shared her family's fate. We then switch back to the present, and the awkwardness in Tiffany's voice is palpable as she confesses to Clancy that she's begun to pray once again. Now is as good a time as any, and Tiffany prays to God for a better future for the Crossed, a better evolution, because frankly, in her opinion, humankind weren't that different from the Crossed in the first place. She then begins to tell Clancy how grateful she is for him having listened to her ramblings. All she wanted all along was to be heard. She then begins to spiral and says, "Every boyfriend I've ever had, every lover, not one of them could shut the fuck up and listen. So whatever you are thinking or doing in there, I know there's gotta be more to it than just a monster being monstrous." Little does Tiffany know that Clancy has been getting off on her confessions. He perked up when she spoke about her past lovers, and on the next page, it's revealed that Clancy has cut off 3 of his fingers and shoved them up his butt. We then see another moment from the past, the time when Jack had been accepted into university on scholarship. Clancy was busy playing games on his PC when Jack knocked on his door and told him about his exciting news. However, Clancy wasn't impressed. He simply went back to his screen and told Jack, "I guess that means all the crap I've put on my own shoulders over the years finally paid off." And this is when Jack completely ignores Clancy's remark and says, "That being said, I think we can all agree that part of all that was not being here for you enough. I know I've been distant since we were little, and I wanted to say, I'm sorry. I really am, dude." He then tells Clancy that even though he'll be shipping off to a faraway city tomorrow, Clancy can call him if he ever needs his big brother. This infuriates Clancy, but he manages to contain his anger and go back to his game. Jack, however, finds this offensive. He finally steps into Clancy's room, puts a hand on Clancy's shoulder, and says, "Clancy, you could stop your damn game for a second and acknowledge my..." But before Jack can complete his sentence, Clancy grabs his hand and shoves it away. He then stares at Jack angrily and says, "Don't you ever come into my room without asking. Jack then leaves Clancy's room like a whipped dog. That night, we're introduced to the cross spiker, who has finally found his way into Woodhill. This is Saul, and he starts shouting and screaming in the baseball field, which alerts everyone in town. So, minutes later, Jack and Tiffany are out on the street talking to their neighbor Jimmy. Jimmy is panicking like crazy. He fears that their safe days have finally come to an end, but Jack tries to handle the situation by remaining calm. He reminds Jimmy that there's only one cross according to the townspeople, which means that if they act now, they can take care of the problem easily. Jimmy, however, doesn't understand Jack's calm demeanor. The crossed are here, for Christ's sakes. There could be more of them hiding and wreaking havoc all over town. Jack then states that if this was the case, they would have heard the screams by now. And because there are no screams, this means it's just one crossed for now, which means all they have to do is hide and protect themselves. Jack thinks he's a big badass in front of Tiffany when he then tells Jimmy, "There's only one sensible thing to do in the situation, Jimmy. I suggest you get busy and do the same." Jack's genius plan is to barricade and trap himself and Tiffany in their house. He brings out a bunch of planks and begins covering up the living room windows. Once that's done, he heads upstairs and covers all the rooms not in use, and then finally barricades Clancy's door. Once the job's done, he huffs and puffs, clearly way too proud of his work. But Tiffany tells him that this isn't going to work. "Haven't you ever seen Night of the Living Dead?" But Jack rudely tells her, "Stop! It's beautiful." Jack is clearly losing his mind because after he and Tiffany have retreated into their separate rooms, he brings out a bottle of cheap tequila he kept hidden for emergencies. Jack has never had too much to drink before. In fact, he's only been drunk once or twice in his life. And at first he fears that the tequila might have expired, considering how long he kept it hidden. But then his anger takes over. Jack opens the bottle, takes a huge shot from it, and heads downstairs into the basement. It's now time for his first drunk therapy session. He pulls out his chair, his pretentious notebook, then begins the session by asking Clancy about the dreams he has as one of the crossed. Clancy graphically describes how he wants to violate Jack using his own skull as a means, and Jack smiles, smirks, and then mocks Clancy by saying that even though he desperately wants to do that, unfortunately he can't because he's stuck in that room. Clancy begins to gnaw at the wound on his hand out of frustration, and this is when Jack doubles down and screams, "That's right, Clancy, you're stuck in there. Could you tell me how that feels? To be completely goddamn impotent? Knowing you want to hurt me, but for the first time in your life, there's not a thing you can do about it?" Jack continues drinking and his rambling. He continues his tirade, calls Clancy names, and then tells him that he's simply a former perverted shell of himself. This enrages Clancy. He begins to punch the door in retaliation. Jack calls him a good-for-nothing little brother who wasn't great to begin with in the first place. Jack calls Clancy a fraud, and in return, Clancy begins to urinate on the door while graphically describing his desires to Jack. Jack decides that he's had enough when Clancy begins to make light of his anger. He slams his notebook on the floor and leaves the basement with the bottle of tequila still in his hands. Minutes later, Jack is out on the streets, stumbling his way through the emptiness of Woodhill. Why is he doing this? Your guess is as good as mine. Maybe it's his alcohol tolerance, which is that of a 10-year-old. Or maybe he's feeling exceptionally lonely after having been cooped up in the house all these days. Or maybe, just maybe, Jack has finally manned up enough to throw his life away. Either way, he doesn't last long out there to fulfill whatever he had in mind. Drunk Jack fails to notice a dead body on the ground in an alley, trips over it, and then hits his head on the dumpster. This knocks him out instantly, and Jack is passed out for a good few hours beside the decapitated and dismembered body of someone. He momentarily wakes up when people about him start screaming because they're being attacked by the crossed, but then he passes out again. When he finally does wake up, he's horrified by the body in the alley and then what's become of his town. Jack watches in horror as his neighbor and friend Jimmy sprints through the streets while being chased by the crossed. He watches as Saul and all those that he's turned finally catch up to Jimmy, grab hold of him, and then start eating him alive. One even has a knife, and he uses it to tear open Jimmy's stomach. These moments are few and far between in a man's life, but when faced with them, they test the man's mettle. Jack's mettle is being tested right now, and he fails the test spectacularly. Jack simply holds his mouth shut, then retreats into the alley slowly, while abandoning Jimmy to his death. He soon reaches back home, barricades the small window in the basement that he used to get out, and starts making his way upstairs. Even though he's scared to death, Jack's mind begins to hatch a plan to finally get him on Tiffany's good side. He begins to believe that this is his chance to be Tiffany's knight in shining armor. If he can save her, get her out of the town, then maybe, just maybe, she won't be so repulsed by him. When Jack hears Clancy screaming, "Just do it, do it, do it," he thinks that his cross brother is having one of his manic episodes, which is perfect for Jack's plan, because he can now use it to further enhance the gravity of the situation when he convinces Tiffany. Jack tells himself that he may have never had a girlfriend, but he knows that there's one thing that turns women on: a real-life hero. With his fake confidence and plans to manipulate Tiffany in mind, Jack walks upstairs only to be greeted by his worst nightmare. Clancy wasn't screaming "do it" again and again because of some manic episode. No, he was ordering Tiffany to pleasure herself, which she was doing right now while seated on Jack's therapy chair in front of Clancy's barricaded door. Crossed, Shrink, issue number 4. How low can you stoop? Getting caught while pleasuring yourself is something too familiar for Jack. He's experienced it numerous times in his life. And now that he's caught Tiffany in the act, all the memories come flooding back. It was his mother who caught Jack the first time. He was pleasuring himself in the backyard near his dog's kennel with some dirty magazines that he managed to get his hands on. Jack was 13 years old then. As for why he chose his dog's kennel as the perfect spot to do the deed, who knows? 3 years later, when he was 16, he was caught pleasuring himself again by his camp counselor at the summer camp. Jack had been too eager, and he had started as soon as the lights had been switched off. Naturally, he was ridiculed and bullied for the entire duration of the camp, but now that Jack reminisces about the incident, he tells us that it progressively got less embarrassing the more he was caught. Then, Jack was caught 5 years later in a horrifying situation by his Aunt Melissa. Jack was busy pleasuring himself in his room with a picture of his aunt when she suddenly barged in. After having been caught so many times, Jack assumed he had seen it all. But now that he had caught Tiffany in the act, he had been proven wrong once again. Tiffany quickly scrambles to cover herself as soon as she spots Jack, while Jack begins to panic and say, "This cannot be happening. This cannot be happening. You cannot be doing this." Tiffany tries to explain herself. She tries to tell Jack that this is a very complicated situation, and that this has nothing to do with him. However, this is when Clancy decides to join their conversation for the first time. He laughs maniacally and begins mocking his older brother because, like always, the girl in his life wants Clancy, not him. Tiffany ignores Clancy's comments and says, "You of all people should understand the psychological implications, Jack. Just wanting to forget what he is, forget what they are, trying to render the whole thing inert. Look, whatever this is horrible. Human behavior in this kind of crazy situation? You understand, Jack, right?" But Jack is having none of it. He's visibly angry, and when he's heard enough, he simply shoves Tiffany's hand off his shoulder. He then has his outburst, and Jack screams, "Are you fucking kidding me? You're gonna armchair me. You want to talk about human nature? Fine, let's talk about human nature. If I've learned anything from this, it's that psychology means jack shit. And everyone was right when they said women are just a bunch of sluts." It takes a few moments for Tiffany to digest what Jack just said, and with each moment, she grows angrier. Jack tries to take back what he said, but unfortunately, it's too late. The very next second, Tiffany punches him across the face before he has the audacity to apologize again. She then spits in Jack's face, packs her stuff, grabs her bag, and begins to storm out of the house. The Crossed seem a much better deal to Tiffany when compared with Jack. Jack tries to stop her. He says, "I can make up for this, Tiffany. You don't understand how much I need you." But Tiffany simply tells him to eat shit and continues on her way. While she's removing the planks of wood from the front door, she angrily turns around to Jack and screams, "You're good for nothing. People like you are lower than scum. To think you actually claim to be some kind of advocate for good? Christ! You can beg all you like, but I'm gone." But when Tiffany opens the door, the scene outside the house makes her stop dead in her tracks. The scene outside is a massacre. Blood-covered toys, the sound of flesh being torn in every direction, the snarling of the Crossed, and the grinding of human teeth. It's all too much for either of them to stomach. They watch as people get their throats ripped out, their skin torn off, multiple of them are stabbed, many are burned, and almost all of them are violated against their will. Tiffany quickly closes the door, and Jack stumbles on the floor due to an anxiety attack. Tiffany tells Jack that they need to think of something fast, but Jack has lost all hope. He already thinks that they're dead, and this is when Tiffany tells him to shut up. She racks her brain to come up with a plan, and this is when Jack begins to panic about the banging at the door. It sounds like someone is banging a dead body on it, and when Tiffany checks the peephole, she is face to face with Saul, who flashes her. Tiffany quickly reels back in disgust, and this is when Jack loses it. He begins to sob like a baby, and Tiffany has to force him to stop because they need to act fast. One way or another, the Cross are going to find them, so they need to come up with an ingenious plan while they still have the time. She stares him directly in the eyes and says, "I consider myself a clever person, Jack. You might be a dickish little man, but I know you're nothing if not logically intuitive. So we're going to go upstairs, and we're going to put our heads together, and we're going to get out of this mess now." Jack stares at her dumbfounded and then stupidly says, "I think I may have just fallen in love with you." In that instant, Jack is reminded of his graduation. His mother was beside him for the photo op, and once that was done, she complimented Jack on his outfit and for graduating as valedictorian. Jack took this opportunity to admire how gracefully his mother was aging, but soon got a call that forced him to pull himself away from her. It was Clancy, and Jack was surprised to hear from his brother. Clancy congratulated Jack, and in turn, Jack asked where Clancy was. Clancy didn't give a clear answer. He simply told Jack that he was in a beautiful place where kids could do whatever they wanted. He was in Neverland. In reality, Clancy was in a drug house with 2 addicts and what seemed like an overdosed woman. Jack had then tried to pursue Clancy to come back. He told him that he and Mom were worried about Clancy, and this is when Clancy lashed out. The fact that Jack was still pretending to be worried about him appalled Clancy. He told his older brother, "Let me tell you something, Jack. One day the world is going to peel you open, and everyone is going to see what kind of guy you really are underneath. A frightened, stunted dipshit who never cared about anyone but himself. A very shitty dude who had to try to become the man of the house because he couldn't bear to release himself from his mom's tit. And on that day, I'll be laughing my ass off. And so, we switch back to the present as Clancy starts laughing like a madman in his room. He screams that it started, and in return, Jack screams, "Die, Clancy!" Tiffany chides him and leads him to the bedroom. She forces him to brainstorm with her, and the two of them quickly figure out that they only have one option. They need to run away. The forest around Woodhill is dense, and it should be safe enough now that all the crossed in the area have been attracted to this massacre. This is when Jack jumps in, like what he's been dreaming of. Tiffany's knight in shining armor, her real-life hero. He says, "Look, I know what we have to do. I'm gonna go out and distract them, and you're gonna wait a few minutes and run like hell. You beeline for the forest." Tiffany refuses the offer at first, but Jack plays his part really well. He acts like a mopey dog, tells Tiffany that this is his chance to redeem himself, but all he tried to do was give her some peace and solace, but he's only managed to make her life more miserable. He manages to convince her, and Tiffany says, "Jack, I don't know what to say. If you didn't sexually repulse me and you weren't a total asshole, I'd probably have given you a kiss right now." Jack continues to play his part and sincerely apologizes for his past actions. Jack then takes it a step further and pretends he wants to say goodbye to Clancy for old time's sake. After all, he's his brother. Tiffany buys it and tells Jack that she admires him for making this choice. She decides to wait in the living room while Jack says goodbye. Jack heads into the basement, pulls up his chair and notebook, and then takes a seat. He then gives Clancy a long-winded professional speech as his supposed psychologist. Jack says, "Well, Clancy, this appears to be our last session. If I'm going to be honest with my diagnosis, you have not made any progress at all. In fact, you were always a bit emotionally stunted, and that didn't really change when you became a monster. But really, who could fault you for acting on your base human instincts? Wanting to experience things and not analyze them to death is a good quality, even if those experiences are having with skulls and biting off your own body parts. If any of this gets through to you, just know that when I'm gone, that I admire you, and I always have. You lived free, and you'll die free. And that's more than I can say for myself. And for that, I love you, Clancy. And finally, I have to thank you for not saying anything about it to her." Clancy had been waiting for this confession, because as soon as Jack says this, Clancy smiles widely and says, "Waiting, you fucking idiot. I've been waiting for the right time." Clancy then screams at the top of his lungs, "Mommy, Jack put his finger in my poop hole. Mommy, why won't you believe me? He did it, and he keeps doing it. He won't stop. He always does it in the dark. He's sick." And this is when Jack begins to panic. He begs Clancy to stop, but the damage is done. Tiffany's heard everything. However, she hasn't caught on yet. She simply thinks Clancy's having one of his crossed manic episodes. She asks Jack what made him suddenly go off. And in turn, Jack frantically says to her, "It's not true, Tiffany. I promise. He's lying. He always lies." And this is when Tiffany puts two and two together. If it's just sick gibberish from across, why is Jack freaking out over this? And that's when she realizes that Clancy is telling the truth. She now understands why Jack and Clancy have such a tumultuous relationship, why Jack never wanted to help Clancy in the first place, why he wanted Clancy to mess his life up and stay away from home. It all makes sense now. Jack tries to deny everything. He tries acting stupid. He tries to tell Tiffany he doesn't know what she's talking about, but it doesn't work. Tiffany angrily calls out his bluff and orders him to stay away from her. Meanwhile, across, Clancy laughs and comments how ironic it is that he would let Jack do anything to him. Upstairs, crocodile tears have started to flow down Jack's cheeks as he says, "I was just a kid, Tiffany. I didn't know what I was doing. I shouldn't have to pay for something I didn't even mean to do." But Tiffany, onto his shtick now, screams, "You're a monster. You let him destroy himself because you couldn't repent." Jack continues walking towards her and screams, "What? Admit it? Can you imagine admitting to something like that? You have no idea what it's like. No idea." By now, Jack has cornered Tiffany. She orders him to stay away from her. But when it's clear to Jack that she won't buy his lies anymore, he simply opens the front door, kicks Tiffany out of the house, and closes the door again. By the time Tiffany gets up, the cross have already surrounded her, and in her last moments, she screams and calls Jack a coward and curses him to burn in hell for all eternity. Jack hears Tiffany getting mauled by the cross, and then he takes a few minutes to gather himself. He wrestles to accept what he's just done, that Clancy was right. But when he's accepted his crimes, he simply heads back down to the basement and opens the door to his brother's room. Jack simply walks inside without a word, and then takes a seat beside his brother. The two of them spend a minute or two in deafening silence before Clancy finally turns to him and says, "What a f***." And Jack mechanically looks at Clancy and says, "Sure." And that, folks, is the end of our story.